For centuries, humans have been growing alongside our botanical brethren. Our histories have mixed and mingled to bring us modern medical marvels, faded folklore, and everything in between. Of course, in order to understand the plant, we have to start with its roots. I'm M. Grubner Gaddis, and this is Rooted. Hello, and welcome back to another week of Rooted, where this time I wanted to talk about a tree you've maybe never heard of, despite probably using it pretty often. Cork. I had no idea that corks literally grew on trees. Well, I guess the whole tree is made of one really big cork, but that's kind of besides the point. I didn't know this until we got to visit one at the Natural History Museum here in Los Angeles, which made me ask about a million questions, like, how long does it take to grow a tree that makes cork, and how often can you harvest it, and what's that even like? How do you get into cork farming? With all that in mind, this week I wanted to answer those questions for myself and take you along for the ride. For starters, all cork comes from cork oak, or Quercus suber, which is an evergreen oak with a native range spanning from Europe to the Mediterranean. And while that's kind of a narrow band, it does make sense because this tree is old. We're talking each tree can live up to 200 years old. And much like older adults, they need specific conditions to thrive, okay? And in this case, the conditions are not too crowded, not too much light, not too cold, and with enough humidity and nutrients in the soil to just kind of chill most of the time. And honestly, can we blame them? That's kind of what we're all looking for, right? And with all those factors in mind, the absolute best spot for them is going to be Portugal and Spain, with Portugal actually producing about 50% of the world's entire cork supply. As far as looks go, this tree is pretty tall, maxing out at about 50 feet and growing to a diameter of 39 inches, which is actually pretty thick for a tree. Their leaves are described as being leathery, toothy ovals that grow on slender sticks and become huge, knotty branches as they age. The bark starts smooth, but gets scraggly and kind of spongy looking with age, which we'll touch on in a second. Like most oaks, these guys produce acorns, and while they are technically edible with enough leaching, from what I've read, it's a lot of work for very little payoff, so you'd be better off finding a different acorn with more sugars to snack on. Now, back to that bark. This is actually going to be our main focus, since, as you might have guessed, this is where we get the actual cork material from. And it's kind of a process. I think the best way to take you through it is to go through it in terms of the life of the tree. So, from the ages of 1 to 25, the only thing cork oaks are doing is staying alive and growing. As they start reaching maturity, they put on a whole bunch of extra layers of cambium, which protects them from the fires known to spread through their region and helps them to retain moisture and stay cool in the hotter, dry months. After 25 years, we're ready for our first cork harvest, which has to be done entirely by hand and by people who know what the heck they're doing. This first harvest tends to be a little wonky, and the densities can vary a lot, with some having less room for air pockets and some layers having more or bigger gaps while the tree was getting established. This is normal, but it does mean it's not the best quality, so the cork is referred to as male cork and will probably only be used for things like mats and other industrial or building uses. After this harvest, the tree will be cared for and tended to for another 9 to 12 years. And that's just because any sooner and harvesting the bark could harm the tree. And the reason it's 9 to 12 years is because farmers will typically only harvest once every 3 years to be able to manage any pests or infections that might come to these oak forests more frequently if they did it every single year. The second harvest is generally better than the first, but it isn't until the third harvest that the cork is consistent enough to be used in wine bottles and other food products, with this harvest and the fourth generally being the best of the best, and therefore the start of the so-called female bark. Most cork oaks will only ever be able to be harvested 20 times at the most, so farmers really have to make each harvest count. Interestingly, cork farming is typically a family farming practice, with most of the trees staying under the care of the same family for generations, and some trees living on a farm and spending their entire lives under the care of one family. And this makes sense when you consider how specific the work is and how much knowledge goes into it. While it's absolutely something you can learn, the work is grueling and honestly pretty inconsistent with that 3-year break between. Many of these farms would say that cork farming is their main source of income, but it's very unlikely to be their only crop. Another interesting fact about cork farmers is that they aren't actually paid by volume or units like most farmers, but are instead paid around $150 an hour for their skills, making them, on average, some of the best paid farmers in the world. But before we all jump into daydreaming of cork farming, let's go over what exactly these people are doing all day during the harvest. For every tree, they have to first, very carefully, with an extremely sharp knife, remove the thinnest layer of outer bark possible. Then, with a different kind of knife, and up to 5 people per tree, they must make clean, long cuts to remove as much bark in one thick, uniform layer as possible, being careful not to cut too deeply to risk harming the tree, or too thinly and risk leaving a bunch behind. Then, in the months that follow, they have to carefully look over the trees to be sure they don't get infected with gnarly canker or eaten by spongy moth larvae while they grow their outer bark back. And when you consider that these trees really hate being close together, and every single one has to be harvested completely by hand, it's a crazy amount of work to do in one season. Additionally, location really matters here. The only cork used is grown and produced in the Fertile Crescent, and it's the only place with the exact right conditions for the buoyant, airy, watertight corks that the wine industry needs to make sure their products are sealed properly, which is kind of a big job, even without risking the wrath of 10,000 wine moms if you mess it up. Honestly, that sounds so scary. I don't think $150 an hour is enough. And Portugal takes its trees seriously. Rightfully so. All of them are protected legally, so it's a felony to cut one down or intentionally harm one. In fact, these forests are so widely loved that they're referred to as the Amazon forest of Europe, and create very unique conditions for biodiversity. When you look online, lots of the photos have baby lynxes hiding behind the trees, and all kinds of birds, bugs, fungi, and other critters rely on them for food, shelter, and safety. So they play a vital role in keeping ecosystems functioning, especially in times where fires disrupt the landscape. Outside of being useful in beverages and biodiversity, cork is actually how we discovered cells. Okay, it's not how we, truly discovered them, but it is how we started piecing it together. And this is because biologist Robert Hooke took a peek at a piece of one of these bad boys and saw all of the chambers under a microscope. And he was inspired to call them cells, which in Latin just means little rooms. And as we kept getting better microscopes, the rooms just kept getting smaller and smaller. As far as folklore goes, the Greeks are said to have viewed cork oaks as a symbol of respect and resilience. But that was about all I could find on them specifically. There is some folklore around oaks, but I'm going to save that for a more general oak episode when we can really dig deep into that, galls, and all kinds of other fun oaky things. If you ever find yourself somewhere that has a cork oak, do yourself a favor and go stare at it for a bit. They are such an interesting tree and absolutely not something most of us would see every day. That's all I've got for this week, but I'll be back next week with a deep dive on the history of houseplants to celebrate PlantCon Orlando being next weekend. See you then! Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to the earth, and just like a plant, drink your water. If you liked the show, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at rooted.pod. We're finally updating regularly on YouTube at rooted.podcast, and you can check out our website, rootedpod.com, for transcripts, updates, merch, and so much more. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me. I'm Grebner Gaddis, edited by Kat Friend of Friend Diagram, and our theme music was written and produced by Eric Cluxon. Rooted is a Henbane Media LLC production.